Our Bible reading this week is in John chapter 7. If you want to grab your Bible and head over there. Jeff and I are going to talk about a little about the reading today. So I'm picking up in 7, and I tried to think about what heading I would give this chapter, and the word I think I settled on was confusion.
Oh, for people's confusion about who Jesus is?
It just seems like one long argument about one question, and that is, what are we to make of this guy? And
right.
Really, really strong divisions of opinion about who he is. Verse 12, if you would look there in chapter 7, maybe it's just a great summary of the chapter. There was much grumbling among the crowds concerning him. Some were saying he is a good man. Others were saying, no, on the contrary, he leads people astray. Yet no one was speaking openly of him for fear of the Jews. And in one sense, I take some consolation from that, because it just says from the very beginning of his time on earth, there's always been argument about Jesus' identity. As much today as there was back then, which really, from one angle, makes sense, because that is the key. What is his identity? And everything just sort of hinges on that question. Once you accept, okay, he is who he says he is, then the dominoes start falling, and I have this obligation to obey the Creator who has come. On the other hand, if he's something less than what he claimed to be, logically, he then becomes a fraud that ought to be rejected. And so you just kind of see that debate happening in chapter 7.
Well, and part of the debate there, part of it is the timing. This is the Feast of Booths, and the chapter does make quite a bit about it being the feast. It even starts with his brothers, who didn't believe in him, hassling him over going up and declaring himself at the feast. And so you have to understand a little bit more about the background of the Feast of Booths by the first century, why this is a really big deal. In fact, one of the things that we haven't talked about this much in the podcast, but John's gospel kind of goes through almost all the Jewish feasts and shows how Jesus is the fulfillment of them in some way. And this is the Feast of Booths. And by the first century, the Feast of Booths, the Passover certainly had messianic overtones, and Jesus will use it as for his so-called triumphal entry, as we call it now. But the Feast of Booths was very messianic. The book of Zechariah, makes the Feast of Booths very messianic. Late chapters of the book of Zechariah.
Let's back up a second, just for the benefit of everyone in the audience. The Feast of Booths or Tabernacles.
Yep, Old Testament's called Feast of Tabernacles, depending on your translation.
Was designed to memorialize the wilderness wanderings and God's provision for them during that time.
Right. And it was one of the 3 major feasts per year that all Jewish males, if they were observant, were supposed to go to Jerusalem. You went up for Passover, you went up for the Feast of Weeks, which is what the New Testament's called Pentecost, and then you had the Feast of Booths. And the Feast of Booths was in the fall. The Feast of Booths came to be associated with kind of the end of the harvest season. And so it was a season of great joy, great celebration, great thanksgiving. It looked back to God got us through the wilderness into the land as we live in the booths, and so we celebrate that. Celebrate the harvest and the bounty of living in a land flowing with milk and honey. But that's part of why, again, Zechariah kind of sets the Feast of Booths late in chapters 13 and 14 of Zechariah in a messianic vein. It's associated with the coming of the Messiah, the ultimate fulfillment of God delivering his people. And so this was a feast. That's part of why his brothers are chiding him about going down at the Feast of Booths and declaring himself, showing himself, and also why there's so much conversation about who is he when he does go down to the Feast of Booths, because it is a very messianic time.
Do you think the brothers are a little frustrated that their brother is the source of so much controversy and heat, and they just want him to kind of declare himself, come clean about who you are and what you're up to, because there's all this fuss going on about you that surely kind of overshadows them as well as the family.
Right. Well, that verse 5, which was I was looking there for, where it says even his brothers weren't believing in him. I can't help but take it as a little bit of mockery too. I mean, because other gospels do make clear that his family thought he was insane.
Yeah, they come for him. Go get your brother. He's lost his mind.
We're cheating using the synoptics to help us out there, but in the synoptics, there's at least a point at which his family just thinks he's nuts.
Right.
And so I tend to I can't help but remember that as part of the background. So that it's either sarcasm, mockery. They don't believe he really is the guy. And so, he's either going to make a fool of himself in Jerusalem doing that, or he's going to get himself killed in Jerusalem. But either way, I mean, they're not his friend. If they really don't believe he's the guy, they're not his friend for kind of nudging him about, hey, don't do this in secret, man. Go public, go big.
Yeah, I mean, it's the depth of the conflict too, because even his own house is divided about it.
Yeah. So they're kind of mocking him a little bit. Go down to Jerusalem at one of the biggest messianic overtone feasts of the year and play your card, man. And see what happens. And so, so you've got that going on in the background. And it also, and this whole section goes into John chapter 8. It'll be in our next week's reading as well, Jesus' presence at the feast when he does go. And where he's going to talk about, his living water conversation here, and then his light of the world in John chapter 8. It wasn't in the Old Testament, but both of those, there were two rituals, one involving water, one involving fire, that came to dominate or came to happen by the first century as part of the Feast of Booths ceremonies in Jerusalem. And so Jesus is riffing off of that whole setting when he does identify himself and say, this is what it is. I am the river of living water. He's riffing off of Ezekiel 47, Isaiah 55, Zechariah 13. The idea that in the days of the Messiah and in the days of God's restored temple, there will be a river of flowing water coming forth. And so they had a water ritual they performed where the priests in those days would go down to the pool of Siloam, get water, bring it back up in a big procession to the temple and pour it out during the Feast of Booths. And Jesus is saying, I am that. Y'all are poorly imitating that, anticipating that. I am what Ezekiel talked about. I am what Zechariah talked about. So the Messianic Feast of Booths in a sense is starting to happen. And I am the guy, but you're not getting it. And thus, the controversy, the conversation, that's why verse 40, after he makes this comment about living water, he's riffing off of this big ritual and the messianic expectation from Ezekiel, from Zechariah, about the days of the Messiah and water and the temple and all of that. And they're wondering, is this really the prophet? Is this the Christ? And thus, the controversy really kicks into high gear, because some have at least figured out he's playing the Messiah card within the overtones of how we've understood the Old Testament, but it's not still what we were expecting, because we expected a literal stream pouring out of the temple, not like Ezekiel talked about. We didn't expect this guy, and especially Galilee. The old Galilee canard comes back up. So
it's interesting that on the other side of that, you have these people like the latter part of 31. When the Christ comes, he will not perform more signs than those which this man has, will he? And so you have the problem of the signs, which of course is one of the things John's playing as we go through the book. Because if he is what they say he is, if he is a deceiver who's deceiving the crowd, and they're ready to kill him, well then, okay, how do you account for his miracles?
Right.
And so you've got, and one of the phrases I love in chapter 7 is verse 48, where the rulers say, hey, have any of us believed in him?
Right.
There's their evidence card. The important people do not think he's the Messiah.
And by the way, we still have that today. The experts, the smart people,
exactly.
The university professors don't believe this is historical, so you shouldn't either.
Right.
It's still the same way today.
But the pushback is, but what do we do with this evidence? What do we do with this evidence?
Right.
And so there is this battle just goes back and forth between them.
And by the way, Nicodemus makes a cameo in that argument in verse 50. Right. Nicodemus, who came to him by night, is now in the daytime starting to at least make procedural maneuvers. We should at least give him a fair hearing if we're going to do this. The law, does our law judge him without first giving him a hearing and learning what he does? Let's do this the right way if we're really going to put him on trial, so to speak, as opposed to just try him in the media, we'd say today.
Right. Well, and then there's the other one in verse 46 that jumps out at me, and that is these guys they send to arrest him come back empty-handed.
Yeah.
And the response is, never has a man spoken the way this man speaks.
Yeah.
I would really like for that to be unpacked a little bit, because my brain goes some different directions with what they mean by that. But they are so captivated by him for whatever reason that they don't arrest him and they come back. And so 7 is just bizarre at the very, not just opinions are divided, but the huge gap between how these people see Jesus. And as I said, it gives us some consolation because people are just as divided about him today.
Well, and because, and you know, again, if you wanted to, you know, an interesting thing to do with John's gospel in particular is just, you know, I don't always advocate for just, you know, simple concordance chases the words because words have meanings and context, but just chase the word will through the Gospel of John, because that's, you know, John highlights this is a test of wills. Do you want to see him? Because if you want to see him, you'll see him. If you don't want to see him, you know, he's revealing himself in a way that gives you, you know, an opportunity to use your shallow excuses to blind yourself. It's a test of will as much as a test of intellect. You know, I'm not smart enough to connect the dots and see this or understand this. It's not that. I don't want to see him. It's like, for instance, verse 52, when the experts have said, have we also been deceived? Have any of the authorities or the Pharisees believed in him? You know, then they replied, no prophet comes from Galilee, verse 52. The best part of that is they're wrong, because Jonah comes from Galilee. Nahum comes from Galilee. In fact, the name Capernaum in their language is Kafar Nahum. It's literally village of Nahum. Nahum comes from Galilee, and Jonah came from Galilee. So the experts, as they're playing the expert card, are literally factually wrong about something that a 10-year-old could open up the Old Testament scriptures and see just on the fact, no real deep comprehension required to see where Jonah was from.
I think that's one of the important things to do when you analyze the arguments is to first notice the simplicity of the people who come to his defense.
Yeah.
Okay, well, he's performing miracles.
Right.
We'll see that, I think, vividly displayed in John 9, when you've got the blind man with no credentials, in essence arguing the credentialed people into the corner with just simple evidence. Okay, I was blind, now I see. How do you explain that? And by contrast to that, the weakness of the argument from the people in the know, that ultimately they're just coming back to, well, you know, we're the smart people, you should believe us on this.
Right.
And I think there is an opportunity here for parents to talk to kids. We try to bring that into the discussion periodically. I think we need to make our children aware that these controversies exist. And talk openly as we go through this chapter. You know, just like these people argued about Jesus, people argue about Jesus today. And some people are going to say this, some people are going to say he's a myth, some people are going to say he's just a historical character or he's a great philosopher or whatever, and help kids understand the argument continues from John 7 even until this day.
And that it's always been, as a class, as a group, the credentialed experts who are often the ones advocating against him.
Yeah, be careful about the credentialed expert.
Be careful about the credentialed
Those guys
experts.
with a PhD.
Yeah, those guys especially.
Well, those are things to think about as you go through the book this week, and maybe or the chapter this week, and maybe an opportunity to bring that into the lives of your kids as they prepare to face a world that also has doubts about Jesus.